moments in the history of Western Europe from the end of the Roman Empire, so that's kind of 4th century, until the Renaissance, so that's round about 1500. Within a broadly chronological context, so roughly we'll be moving through time, starting next week until the end of the course. Within a broadly chronological context, we will examine the various political, religious, and social changes in the West, which occurred during that period. So although it says medieval Europe, I won't be looking a lot at kind of Eastern Europe. It's pretty much kind of the western side of Europe, which is the traditional area, and it's the area I know more about. If you want to work on other parts of what I agree is Europe for your essays and things, then you can discuss that with me. Okay, we'll talk about that later. Okay, here are the 13 topics. This is what we're going to be doing in the next 14 or so weeks. Starting next week, we shall look at the late Roman Empire and what I'm calling the Germanic invasions. The end of the Roman Empire and the arrival of people speaking various kinds of Germanic languages, my Anglo-Saxon ancestors, for example, arriving in what is now Western Europe and eventually kind of taking over and setting up something which becomes very different. So the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, which of course is the phrase from Gibbon, and the Germanic barbarians and what they were, we'll look at. Secondly, 2 weeks from now, Rome's heirs, which in fact I've stolen that phrase from a book by Professor Rosalind Bakitterick in Cambridge, The Barbarian Kingdoms. What did the Germanic people set up? And we'll look particularly at the Merovingians in what's now France, the Visigoths in Spain, and the Ostrogoths and Lombards in Italy. Groups of Germanic people who set up their own kind of little kingdoms and so on. The following week, we shall look at Anglo-Saxon England. We'll find out what was going on in Britain, the end of Roman Britain, the Anglo-Saxon invasions and the early kingdoms, and a bit about the Celts as well. Then we'll look at we'll have already mentioned a bit about Christianity, but then we'll look at the history of Christianity in detail there. Early Christianity, origins of the papacy, and then a little bit about the origins of monasticism. What is monasticism? That's a question there. We know what the word monasticism are. If you called someone or described something as monastic, what does that mean? It's very important individual in medieval Europe. Yeah, a monastery is a kind of a church, and why is it different from another kind of church? What makes it a monastery? What makes it different from other kinds of churches? What gives it its character? Why do we call this one a monastery and this one we don't call it a monastery? Well, they might do, but that's not the main reason. Many monasteries were not very intellectual or whatever. Monks, M-O-N-K, monks. People who decided to worship, this is not just in Christianity, many people decide when they feel very religious to kind of escape from the real world or from the secular world and spend most of their time just contemplating, thinking about God or gods if they're polytheistic. And in Christianity, many people eventually set up what we call monastic communities centered around a church where they would live and in theory spend all their lives there. Copying manuscripts, praying, obviously, doing other things, but not mixing very much with the rest of the society. In the Middle Ages, before the Reformation, and in some parts of Europe still after the Reformation, so the monastic tradition was very important. Carolingians. This is Charlemagne, Charles the Great, and his successors. Okay, they made a big impact, recreating some kind of empire in Europe, and we'll look at not only the politics but also the cultural change and their contribution to Western culture, very important. Then we'll kind of look at two groups who in various ways affected European history, well, you could say positively or negatively depending on your viewpoint. In history we don't usually make comments like that, say this was negative, we just say this is what happened and try and understand it. The Moors, which is the kind of European medieval-ish word for Islam, for Muslims, for the Arabs and so on, the effect of the expansion of Islam in the Near East and Africa, what happened in Europe, obviously very important. And then also my favourites, the Vikings. kings. Okay, what those guys with the beards and the little pointy hats, which of course they didn't have, got up to, and what they did and didn't do, and so on there. So two groups there we'll look at. Then, kind of after that period, we're moving now into the 11th and 12th centuries, what we call here the feudal kingdoms. Should move this down a bit for the benefit of the people watching online. So this is the period after the decline of the Carolingians. We see new kingdoms, primarily what becomes France and what kind of becomes Germany, emerging in Europe. And we'll look a little bit at what goes on in England as well, because the Normans have a very big impact. Does anyone know who the Normans were, what they did, why they're important for British history? And Alp's not allowed to answer that question because he's done a whole course on medieval Britain with me. Anyone else? Who are the Normans? They're not men called Norman or anything, they have another reason. Yeah, okay.
They invaded Britain.
Right.
They came from France.
They came from France, c'est French, oui, oui. And what else? And then they invaded and they stayed, and they became the new kings and so on. So the Anglo-Saxons, the Germanic guys, kind of lose the power, and we get a bunch of Norman